Did you know the World Cup trophy was created by a man who saw football as a path to human dignity, inspired by the same Catholic social teachings that shaped modern human rights? And that some of the biggest football clubs on earth, clubs you watch every single weekend, were literally born inside church buildings, founded by priests and pastors who believed kicking a ball around could save young men's souls? This isn't a conspiracy theory. This isn't some forced connection made up for clicks. This is documented, verifiable history that almost nobody talks about. Today, we're going to trace the hidden religious DNA running through the sport that conquers the planet every 4 years. And by the end of this video, you will never watch a match the same way again. Let's start at the very beginning, because the story of football and Christianity is actually a story of conflict before it becomes a story of cooperation. 200 years ago, Christianity was not friends with football, not even close. In early 19th century England, before the sport had any real rules, the games being played in villages and town squares were chaotic, violent, and frankly dangerous. Mobs of men would chase a ball, sometimes an inflated pig's bladder, through streets, fields, and marketplaces, smashing windows, injuring bystanders, and occasionally killing each other in the chaos. Protestant preachers despised it. They condemned the brutality. They condemned the gambling that always seemed to follow these matches. Men were literally fined for playing football on church property or on a Sunday because it was seen as profane, disorderly, and a waste of a day that belonged to God. So if you went back in time and told a Victorian pastor that football would one day be intertwined with church life, he probably would have laughed you out of the building. But something shifted. As the century moved forward, a new theological idea started spreading through English Protestant circles, especially in schools and universities. It was called muscular Christianity. The core belief was simple but powerful. A disciplined body builds a disciplined soul. If you wanted to raise young men with strong moral character, honesty, teamwork, self-control, courage, physical exercise and organized sport were not a distraction from that goal. They were a tool for achieving it. Headmasters at elite English schools began incorporating sport into the curriculum specifically because they believed it built Christian character. And once that idea took hold, churches stopped resisting football and started using it. This is where things get genuinely fascinating, because some of the most famous football clubs in the world today were literally founded inside churches. Let's talk about Everton. Everton is one of the giants of English football, a club with millions of fans across the globe. Its origins trace back to a Methodist congregation called St. Domingo's, which had a chapel in Liverpool. In the late 1870s, the church already had a cricket team to keep young men active during the summer. The problem was winter. So in 1878, members of that same congregation formed a football team to give the young men something constructive to do during the colder months. Football as an antidote to idleness, organized by the church itself. A reverend named Ben Chambers, who ran the congregation, was an open advocate of muscular Christianity, and he actively encouraged this blend of physical activity and spiritual formation. The team eventually dropped the church name and became simply Everton, but its roots are unmistakably religious. And Everton is not alone. Aston Villa, another massive English club with a long trophy history, was founded in 1874 by 4 young members of the Aston Villa Wesleyan Chapel, a Methodist church in Birmingham. The founders were all in their early 20s, all connected to that same congregation's Bible class. Their very first match was a strange hybrid game against a rugby team, where they played one half by rugby rules and the other half by football rules. A fitting symbol of a sport still finding its identity, born quite literally out of a church youth group. Manchester City has similar roots, as does Southampton. Even Celtic, the legendary Scottish club, was founded with strong religious and community ties. This wasn't a coincidence repeated by accident across multiple cities. It was a pattern. Churches across England saw football as an instrument, a way to keep young working-class men out of pubs, out of trouble, and inside a structure that emphasized discipline, fellowship, and moral growth. Now let's zoom out from individual clubs and talk about the tournament that turns this sport into a global religious experience of its own, the World Cup. Because here, the connection to Christianity isn't just present in the background. It's standing right at the center of the story, in the person of the man who created the tournament. His name was Jules Rimet, a French sports administrator who became president of FIFA in 1921 and held that position for over 3 decades. Rimet is the reason the World Cup exists at all. Before his vision, international football lived inside the Olympic Games, where the format was limited and amateur restrictions made it impossible for the sport to fully grow. Rimet pushed, negotiated, and fought to create something independent, a tournament built exclusively for football, open to professionals, reuniting national teams from across the globe on a stage of their own. It took years of complicated diplomacy, logistical battles, and resistance from skeptics before his vision became reality. And in 1930 in Uruguay, the very first World Cup kicked off with 13 national teams, marking the birth of what would eventually become the most watched sporting event on the planet. Here's what most documentaries about football history leave out. Jules Rimet was a devout, practicing Catholic, and his faith wasn't a side note in his life. It actively shaped how he understood the role of sport in society. Earlier in his life, Rimet was deeply involved in social movements rooted in Christian values, projects designed to bring sport to working-class youth as a tool for community building and personal formation. For Rimet, football was never just about competition or entertainment. He saw it as something closer to a moral exercise, a structured activity where discipline, respect for rules, and cooperation between participants could shape a person's character for the better. This is strikingly similar to the muscular Christianity philosophy we just talked about in England, except now it's coming from a Catholic Frenchman instead of English Protestants, applied not to a single club, but to an entire global tournament representing every nation on Earth. It's worth mentioning the broader intellectual climate Rimet was shaped by. In 1891, Pope Leo XIII published a landmark document called Rerum Novarum, an encyclical focused on the dignity of labour and the just organisation of society. One of its central ideas was that human work and human activity should never be treated as a mere commodity, that every person possesses inherent dignity, and the structures of society, including how people spend their time and energy, should reflect that dignity. While there's no direct documented proof that Rimet was explicitly thinking about this encyclical when he built the World Cup, historians agree that this was the intellectual water he was swimming in. The emphasis on human dignity, on community, on activities that elevate rather than degrade the person. That was the Catholic social thinking saturating French intellectual life at the time, and it lines up perfectly with how Rimet talked about football's purpose. So when you watch the World Cup trophy get lifted every 4 years, you're watching the culmination of a vision built by a man who genuinely believed, on religious grounds, that organised sport could be a force for human dignity and international peace. That's not a forced metaphor pulled out of nowhere. That's the documented motivation of the tournament's founder. Now let's bring this story closer to home to Brazil, because nowhere on earth is the marriage between football and Christian faith more visible than on the Brazilian national team. If you've watched Brazilian football at any point in the last few decades, you've seen it. Players pointing to the sky after scoring, dropping to their knees in prayer, wearing undershirts with messages like Jesus Cristo é o Senhor revealed after a goal. This isn't an isolated quirk. It's part of the cultural identity of the sport in Brazil. Evangelical and Catholic faith runs through Brazilian locker rooms in a way that's hard to find anywhere else in world football. And players have used the global stage of the World Cup, watched by billions of people simultaneously, as a platform to publicly declare their faith. Kaká became one of the most recognized examples of this in the early 2000s, but he's far from the only one. For many Brazilian fans, watching their national team play isn't separate from their spiritual life. It's intertwined with it. So let's connect all the threads. Does this mean football was invented as a Christian sport? No. The earliest forms of ball games go back thousands of years, to ancient China, to Mesoamerica, to Greece and Rome, long before Christianity existed at all. And there's no historical evidence that Jesus himself ever played anything resembling football. The ball games of his time and place belonged to Greek and Roman culture, not Jewish Galilee, and the Gospels say absolutely nothing about it. What we're talking about here is different and honestly more interesting. It's the story of how Christian institutions and Christian individuals shaped the version of football that conquered the world. English churches gave us some of football's first organised clubs, built specifically as tools of moral and spiritual formation. A devout Catholic gave us the World Cup itself, driven by a vision of sport as an instrument of human dignity. And in Brazil, faith became woven directly into how players express themselves on the biggest stage the sport has to offer. Football is often called a religion by people who've never set foot in a church. Fans talk about temples, about faith in their team, about rituals before kickoff. It usually gets dismissed as just a figure of speech, a poetic exaggeration. But after everything we've just traced, church-founded clubs, a Catholic tournament founder driven by religious conviction, players turning goal celebrations into public prayer, maybe it's not just a metaphor after all, or maybe football and Christianity have been walking the same road, quietly, for over a century and a half. If this kind of hidden history fascinates you the way it fascinates me, make sure you're subscribed, because we dig up stories like this every single week. The connections nobody else is talking about, backed by real research, not lazy assumptions. Drop a comment and tell me, did you know any of this before today? Or did this completely change how you'll watch the next match? I'll see you in the next one.